Ahui ho, stay awake, stay awake. In 2004, my best friend was an opera singer named Jennifer Lopez. Now, Jennifer was not the famous actor known as J-Lo, although the two of them were born in about the same year, about a year apart from each other, and they had kind of a similar energy level, high level of energy. And in her early 40s, Jen was diagnosed with ALS, with Lou Gehrig's disease, and she came back to California to live in her parents' house and basically to come back and to die. I visited Jen every Wednesday, and every Wednesday it started out the same. She'd ask how my family was, then she'd ask how the sickest people in the congregation were, then she'd ask how my dissertation was. She knew what I was really wrestling with, and she always understood that. She understood what mattered to me. She was kind of like the perfect confidant. She was someone I could speak honestly to about my frustrations with my dissertation advisor or the church leadership without worrying what she might think of me. Jen always gave people the benefit of the doubt. And Jen learned to sing in our church. And I can imagine as a girl first beginning to realize her great talent. On some visits, we would watch videotapes of her operas. I loved watching her sweep down the stage in a flowing dress, singing so powerfully. Her face in those performances showed so much emotion and sensitivity. Once, I confided to her that sometimes when I watched an opera singer or heard a musician like a cellist, I almost secretly fell in love with them and wondered what their life was like when they weren't on stage. Well, this is it, she said, and she gestured to her wheelchair as she joked. We spent so many hours laughing together. Now, strangely, my favorite images of Jen all came from her family photo albums. And maybe you remember those photos that were taken in the 70s. The color's too bright. They're brighter than real life. And those pictures of graduation and band trips and all the things that she did with her family and friends, they expressed a wonderful youthfulness and energy and just a kind of all-around zaniness. She was in the marching band at UCLA. Over time, Jen lost the ability to speak, but because we spent so much time together, I could still understand her. More than most, Jen loved life, and there were times, as it was being withdrawn from her, that she despaired. Sometimes, I still can hear the moaning sound that at the end of her life was the only way that she could express this disappointment. But Jen never complained. She never lost interest. And above all, the two of us loved Jesus. And I don't know about you, but it's hard to find companions who love Jesus. And they are so precious. Before she got sick, she'd been in the process of getting ordained. And there's so many times that I keep imagining what it would have been like if the two of us had had a long career of serving God's people together. When I think back on those Wednesdays, I realize we talked a lot about death. But my overwhelming memory is that we were awake. We were awake to the simplest joys of life and to its ultimate tragedies. We were awake to the way that God's invisible love surrounds us like a blanket on a winter's night. The darkness that we experience together, Jen and I, is the darkness of Advent. And today we celebrate the first Sunday of the new year. And I think it's amazing. The church calendar could have started with the joy of Easter, or with the vulnerability and the newness of Christmas, or with that fiery energy of Pentecost. But instead, each year starts in the shadow of war, hatred, and sorrow. We begin in darkness, waiting, singing, and praying for new light. Yesterday, hundreds were killed in Gaza as the war returned. We pray for an end of the violence in the Middle East, in Africa, and Ukraine. we refuse to turn our eyes away from the suffering. In America, as the secular world prepares for a consumer Christmas, I know you must feel this. We leave this little space and we go out in the world, and it's just like a totally different reality, isn't it? As all the Santa Clauses are out, and as the Christmas songs are starting to play in the stores. Christians almost could not be more out of step, could we? We are awake, waiting for Christ to come in glory at the end of time. The older I get, the more I treasure the Advent hymns that we sing. As a child, I thought they sounded kind of depressing and in a minor key. We sing, Zion hears the watchman singing, her heart with joyful hope is springing. She wakes and hurries through the night. On this first Sunday of the church year, as we wait for the advent of Christ, we begin a new story of Jesus. The principal way we know about Jesus is through the four Gospels. There are three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are called the Synoptic Gospels because they look the same, synoptic. And then there's John, which is very different. So the church calendar year follows those Gospels. So the first year is Matthew, which we just finished. The new year, which we're starting today, is Mark. And next year will be in the year of Luke. And the Gospel of Matthew fills out the other readings in those years. Each Gospel has its own perspective, its own driving aim. Today, we remember that the Gospel of Matthew uses 5 sections, like the 5 books of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Matthew is trying to express the idea that Jesus is a new Moses. Luke describes Jesus as the Lord's royal servant who brings God's light to the nations of the world. And John explains how Jesus reunites us with a God in a way that we just could not have done on our own. But today we are starting the year of Mark. Mark explains how humanity comes to have a new start. He writes about a new reality called the kingdom of God, which comes into history and transforms everything. Mark uses a simpler vocabulary, simpler grammar to form powerful and compact sentences. Mark's favorite word is the word euthus. It appears so many times, it means immediately. It's like a sense of immediacy that it conveys. He uses it so many times, the translators don't even translate them all. They just leave them out because there's so many uses of that word. Mark presents the reader or the hearer with a choice about who Jesus is. The only time that Mark is really clear about where he stands is in the first verse of the entire book. Mark writes, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So the Gospel of Mark has 3 sections. The first takes place in Galilee, and this last takes place in Jerusalem, and the middle section is as Jesus travels from one place to the other. The first part, which is in Galilee, is about how the world wonders who Jesus is. Mark quotes Malachi and Isaiah, describing Jesus as a kind of messenger from God. At Jesus' baptism, a voice from heaven says, "You are my son, my beloved." Jesus heals people. He casts out their demons. He forgives their sins. He tells them about God's kingdom using stories about a sower and seeds, about a tiny mustard seed that grows into a great plant. In the second section of Mark, Jesus' friends are struggling to understand who he is. And Jesus, in a conversation with them, says, "But who do you say I am?" And Peter boldly says, "You are the Messiah." But Peter doesn't understand. Peter has in mind a military conqueror who's going to come and replace the Romans so that they can be the new leaders of society. Jesus, instead, subverts the whole idea of a Messiah. He teaches them that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve others. And on the mountain, 2 of Jesus' friends see him talking to Elijah and Moses, and from an overshadowing cloud, a voice says, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Now, the final section shows how Mark shows how Jesus becomes the king. A royal procession takes him into Jerusalem, where he teaches in the temple. And Mark writes, quote, "A large crowd was listening to him with delight." I think so often how much I would have loved to listen to Jesus in that kind of setting. Later, sitting on the Mount of Olives with just 4 of his friends, they ask him, what will the end be like and what signs will be of it? And Jesus answers with the words we just heard. No one, not the angels, not the Son of Man himself, will understand or know when the end will come. So keep awake. The word that Mark uses, gregoreo. So every Gregory you know, the word means to be awake, to be alert, to be literally woke. Jesus becomes the Messiah or King by being crucified, and a Roman centurion seems to be the only one who understands. And that Roman centurion says the same thing that was said in the other 2 sections. The Roman centurion looks at Jesus and he says, "Truly, this man was God's son." And when the women go to the tomb, an angelic young man in white tells them that Jesus has been raised, and the gospel ends abruptly as they flee. Quote, "For terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And that is the end of the gospel. But in each section, you're told that Jesus is the Son of God. And Mark confronts us with this exact question. Who will Jesus be for you? Will Jesus be the Son of God? The 20th century monk Thomas Merton writes, quote, "This is the most complete revolution that has ever been preached. In fact, it is the only true revolution because all others demand the extermination of somebody else. But this one means the death of the person who, for all practical purposes, you have come to think of as your own self." In the season of Advent, we have the chance to prepare a place in ourselves and in the world to receive Christ. Now, there's so much of the divine plan that we cannot hope to understand. Dark places, unmapped territories, and worlds that we could hardly discover. But I invite you to encounter Jesus in our present moment. I want to close with a poem by Steve Garnaas Holmes. The poem is called Longing. Unsuspecting at first, of course, you only gradually begin to feel an urge, a leaning slow to become a promise, a yearning that will become its own gift given from beyond. It grows from a tiny seed, a grace that is not your doing, a single cell, a change of season, a subtle turning of the heart, until by some grace you will know. But now you do not yet. You are still longing. But know this, you are Mary, and Gabriel is near. On my very last visit with Jennifer, I knew I was going out of town, and we both knew that we probably would not see each other again in this world. And I prayed so hard for a miracle that would instantly make her whole and healthy again. And what I discovered was a person who was truly awake, who loved Jesus. That night in a dream, her grandmother, who had died when she was only 9 years old, kept pulling her hand. At the end of our visit, I asked if there was anything she wanted to say before I unplugged her laser pointer for the last time. She pointed out the letters for mahalo, or thank you in Hawaiian. And I told her, ahui ho means see you later, or until we meet again. And she was so tired. She shut her eyes as I read evening prayer with the Song of Simeon. It goes, Lord, you now have set your servant free to go in peace as you have promised. I closed my prayer book. I looked into her face and I said goodbye. And she opened her eyes and she smiled back at me and she mouthed the words, ahui ho. Ahui ho. Stay awake. Stay awake.